How's it going, everyone? This video is a follow-up to a previous video I did looking at whether there is a statistically significant difference between goal differential for the 8 teams that made it to the quarterfinal stage in the World Cup. And what I'm going to talk about in this video is whether goal differential is even a good measure of team performance. And we compared the performance of these teams in terms of goal differential using the ANOVA test. I'm not going to explain how the ANOVA test works in this video. You can look at the previous video to see that, and I'll include a link in the description. What I want to do in this video is actually make a counter argument to the idea that goal differential is a good measure of team performance. Okay, so just as a quick recap, we ran the ANOVA test comparing the different teams in terms of their goal differential, and we got a p-value of about 82%, okay, which means, or higher depending on how we treated shootouts. Okay, so what that means is that assuming that on average these teams would perform the same in terms of goal differential, if the tournament were repeated many times, right? So if these teams are the same in that regard on average, what's the probability of observing the difference that we observe in terms of their performance? And the probability of observing what we see is pretty high, 82%, which means that it's reasonable to assume that, yeah, these teams on average would perform the same. Now, here's the thing with goal differential, okay? The last game played in the group stage, okay, that's the third game. There are certain teams that are guaranteed to make it into the round of 16 after only playing 2 games. So their third game, to them, it doesn't matter if they win or lose, so they can take it easy during that third game, not try as hard, not risk so many injuries. And look what we see. During that third game, we have -1, -1, -1. Of the 8 teams that made it to the quarterfinals, 3 of them lost their third and final game in the group stage. Now I'm going to go to another tab here where we see that highlighted, okay? 3 of them. Now, what else do we know about those 3 teams? Look at Brazil. They won their first 2 games. Look at France. They won their first 2 games. Portugal. They won their first 2 games. They had 6 points by the end of the group stage, and so the third game, they were taking it easy maybe not trying so hard. They lost it. Doesn't matter, still made it into the round of 16. Now, what about the other teams? Netherlands, they tied one of their first 2 games. Argentina, they lost 1. Croatia tied 1. England tied 1. Morocco tied 1. They only had 1 victory going into their third game. And, well, that's more reason to try harder to get the points that they need to make it into the round of 16. So they won it. Croatia tied it, England won it, Morocco won it. So the data for these 3 teams for their third game in the group stage might be not representative of their actual performance. So what happens if we change that data to the average of their first 2 games where they actually had to try harder? Okay, so for Brazil, what if we change it from a -1 to a 1.5, the average of goal differential for their first 2 games. For France, we change it to 2, again, the average of the goal differential for their first 2 games. And for Portugal, we change it to 1.5, again, the average goal differential for their first 2 games. And we run the ANOVA test on that. What p-value do we get then? Well, then we get a p-value of 0.368, or approximately 37%. Now, 37% is not that small, okay? But it is much smaller than the 82 that we see before, okay? So what we see here, right, if we make that assumption that if Brazil, France, and Portugal were trying to their full capability during their third game, that this is actually the goal differential that we would get, and it's okay that we have 1.5 because we're trying to simulate some result here, right? Well, then the chances of observing the difference that we're observing, assuming that these teams would perform the same on average, if the tournament were repeated again and again, well, then the chances of observing the differences that we see, or a greater difference, is much lower, 37%. Okay, that's still reasonable. If the chances of observing something is 37%, it's not rare to observe it. You're going to observe it more than a third of the time, but it is still significantly lower, right? So that says something, right? That's a noteworthy difference, and maybe something that could be considered when trying to assess these teams, right? And look at how the average goal differential changes, right? So for Portugal, for Brazil, right, 1.9-ish, 1.4, right? For France, it goes up to 2, becomes much closer to England's 2.5, right? So there we go, right? It does make a larger difference between these groups, right? Because we have groups with a goal differential approximately 1, and then we have more groups with a goal differential closer to 2. So that is a noteworthy result that I wanted to add in part 2. So hope you enjoyed that too, and I will see you next time.